Having a segmented home or small business network is one of the most important things you can do for overall security. And with a UniFi network, it's straightforward to set up a powerful system. But at the same time, networking terms like VLANs, VPNs, IDS and IPS, etc. can be confusing. So in this video, we'll look at the complete setup of a UniFi network from a beginner's perspective. We'll cover the essentials like the initial setup and adoption, VLANs, Wi-Fi configuration, and then some security. The goal is to help you understand the settings so you can tailor them to your environment and end up with a simple, secure, segmented network, but most importantly, one that you can manage. Real quick, if you need or want a more customized setup, I offer consulting services and I will leave a link to that in the description. Now to get started, plug your ISP modem into your UniFi router. I'm using a UniFi Cloud Gateway Fiber, but it'll be the same no matter which device you're using. If your ISP box is a modem and a router combo, switch it to bridge mode to avoid double net, which basically means plugging a router into a router. I unfortunately can't show you this because I don't have one of them, but it breaks port forwarding and VPNs, and you don't want it configured that way. After everything is plugged in, open the UniFi mobile application and the new Cloud Gateway should pop right up. Go through the initial setup, and then we'll be able to move on to the full network configuration. Now, I think using the UniFi mobile application is the easiest because, first of all, it's the easiest way to set it up, and second of all, it will automatically configure remote access, which is what we're going to use to access and configure the cloud gateway. So after everything is configured, you will be brought to UniFi Network. Now, think of UniFi Network as a way that you're going to manage your entire network. This is going to be all of your physical devices. This is going to be settings, security settings, firewall settings, etc. The point here is that this is one interface, one pane of glass that is going to manage absolutely everything. Now on the left-hand side here, what you're going to see is UniFi devices. And the way that UniFi devices works is basically as soon as you plug something in, it is going to show up in this list here. So I plugged in a U7 Pro Max and you'll see it just popped up as well. But until you adopt them, you can't manage them. So the first step in any network setup is going to be to adopt everything. Now, in terms of your setup, it's going to be slightly different depending on the hardware that you have. Now, you could have more hardware than this, or you could have less hardware than this. If you have something like a UniFi Dream Router 7, you're going to have it all in one device where you most likely won't have any other devices, but that doesn't mean you can't grow into having other devices. So this is the very first step that you're going to take. And after adopting it, everything will be updated and we'll be able to start configuring everything. Now, at this point, our devices are adopted in, which means that we can now manage them. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create our VLANs because we want to change this default subnet. And the way that we're going to do that is by starting to create our VLANs. So inside of the settings here, we can go to networks, and now we're going to have our default network. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is a management network. Now, a management network is optional. What it is really designed for is for your UniFi hardware. If you have a lot of UniFi hardware, it makes sense to have a management VLAN. If you don't have a lot of UniFi hardware, it probably doesn't, and you can skip this and move on to the trusted VLAN. Now, for the management VLAN, if this was a business or an enterprise network, you really don't want to use the default VLAN. The main reason is because if you have a switch and someone was to have access to that switch and there was an open port and they plugged into it, they most likely will hit the management VLAN. A lot of people don't like that. For a home environment, I don't really see the risk, but it's up to you. If you do not want to use the default network as your management network, you can use it as the IoT network or something different. For me, I like to keep it simple, and I'm just going to set it to be management. Now, the next thing I change is I always change from default. So I'm going to use something different. Any other subnet is fine. For this, I'm going to use 10.5.0.1, and then I'm going to leave everything as auto, and I'm going to apply this, and we basically just change the subnet and the name. Now we're going to create our next VLAN, and this is where it's going to be very dependent on exactly what you have and what you want to use for your VLANs. Now, I have a video that covers the VLANs that I think that most people use, and we're going to be using those in this video. But for you, it might be slightly different. Just remember that. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a trusted VLAN. I'm going to change this to to match our subnet, but I'm going to use 10.5.1. And then in the VLAN ID here, I'm just going to set it to be 51. I normally set it to be a combination of something with the subnet. So we're going to set this to be 51. And then all of these other settings can stay as default. Keep in mind, you can customize them if you'd like. Now, the trusted VLAN is going to be for my computers, my smartphones, my NAS device, my servers, etc. If you only have a little bit of hardware, this trusted VLAN is where you could put that hardware as well. I have it split out currently into its own management network, but if you wanted to, you could consolidate everything into the trusted VLAN and then use it that way. So we now have our trusted VLAN. We're going to move over and we're going to create our IoT VLAN. And the IoT VLAN is going to be used for all of your IoT devices. So this is going to be things like smart TVs and thermostats and smart plugs and stuff like that. It's kind of a catch-all for a lot of people, and it's important because we're going to be segregating that traffic. So I changed the VLAN ID to 510, and then I'm going to isolate this network, and we're going to talk about why a little later. So we're going to create this, and then the last VLAN we're going to create is our guest VLAN. And I normally just use a totally separate subnet for this, just something so that I know it's for the guest network. And then I'm going to leave all the other settings as default, and I'm going to create that. So we now have our 4 VLANs here. Now, if you wanted to, you could create a 5th VLAN for your surveillance, we'll say security cameras. Not everybody is going to have security cameras that they want to use, but if you did, it is a good idea to split out that traffic because then you can do things like block access to the internet or really just fine tune some of those settings. But for the most part, these are the default VLANs that most users will have. Now, what you'll see here is that we don't have any IP leases, but we do have 2 for our management network, and that is our UniFi devices. Now, for my UniFi devices, what I like to do is I like to set static IP addresses, and I do this mainly for DNS. There are people that feel like this is not necessary, and for that reason, I'm going to say that this is optional. You do not have to do it. But what I like to do is I like to go into the settings of all of my physical hardware, and I like to set static IP addresses. And this is mainly for DNS right here. So I use different providers. 1.1.1.1 is Cloudflare, 8.8.8.8 is Google. And I do this because if one of them is down, the other should be up, and you will have and maintain DNS. Now for my switches, I normally start off with 10. So 10 to 19 will be my switches. So if I have another, the IP address would end at 11 and then 12 and then 13. And then for my access points, I start at 20 and then I increment up like that. All of these settings here, you can match outside of the IP address and the gateway. And then when you apply that, the cloud gateway fiber will start to get ready. And in a second here, you're going to see that this IP address is going to change. So I'm going to do the exact same thing for the access point. The only difference is the IP address is going to be .20 like I said, and I'm going to apply those settings. And in a second here, this access point will switch over to 10.5.0.20. And now our physical hardware has static IP addresses. The only thing you have to be aware of is if you ever change the management subnet, which you shouldn't right off the bat, you should not change this after you set it up this way. You would have to go in and update those static IP addresses. But again, I would not recommend that you do that. After it's set up, leave it this way. So now that our devices are configured properly, what we have to do is we have to start setting this up so that we can use some of those VLANs. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up Ethernet port profiles. And the reason I like to do it this way is because it ensures that I can manage everything centrally, and then I could just set on my switches the exact ports that I want to use with specific port profiles. And then if it ever has to change in the future, I update this port profile once, and then all of the switches will update as well. So we're going to create a new port profile, and we're going to call this management. Now the management one is the easiest because you're basically just going to leave this as default. Now tagging is very important, and it's going to be different most likely for every single port profile that you create. But you want your management VLAN to be able to tag everything. The reason is because at a later step, we're going to create different Wi-Fi SSIDs. So the easiest way to think about tagging is that if you have one access point, and that one access point is broadcasting multiple SSIDs, so we'll say your trusted VLAN, your IoT VLAN, and your guest VLAN, it has to be able to tag that traffic. If you blocked everything, basically, that access point that is part of this management network here would not be able to tag anything, and then for that reason, it wouldn't be able to pass any of that traffic. So configuring it this way wouldn't work. So we're going to allow everything for our management VLAN. However, for our trusted VLAN, we don't really need to tag everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the native network to be trusted, but then I'm going to go over to custom. And I'm going to set this to only be IoT, and I'm going to set it for a specific reason. Now, like I said earlier, this trusted VLAN is going to have my computers, my phones, my NAS devices, servers, etc. In Proxmox, there are a few virtual machines I run that are on the IoT network, and I want to be able to tag that traffic. If you're not doing anything like that, you basically want to follow a least permissive approach. So for that reason, it's not crazy to block everything because you're not blocking access to that VLAN, you're blocking tagging on that VLAN. So it's basically layer 2 versus layer 3, which is not important. Just think of it like if you want to access another VLAN, that traffic has to go to your firewall. And if the firewall allows it, then you can do what you have to do. If the firewall blocks it and you can't tag it, then you can't access it. So I'm going to set that as custom. I'm going to set it as IoT. I'm going to apply that. And now we have our second Ethernet port profile. And the final one I'm going to create is for IoT. But the difference here is going to be that I'm going to block everything. Now, for some of these VLANs where you want them to be very secure, you want to block tagging. This ensures that they can't do something called VLAN hop. Now, there are things called VLAN hopping attacks. The chances of you running into that are very, very low. But again, the IoT VLAN doesn't have to tag any other traffic, so we shouldn't allow it. So we're going to apply those changes, and I'm not going to create one for the guest network because I don't have any hardwired guest devices. But if you had the surveillance VLAN that we talked about earlier, you would want to create another port profile that is for the surveillance VLAN and then blocks all traffic so that you can use it. So now that we have our port profiles, we have to use those port profiles. So inside of our UniFi device, we're going to pull up that Pro Max switch. And what you'll see is that port 15 right now is for our access point, but we're managing it at the port level at this point. And again, this is why port profiles are important, because if we ever had to change this for whatever reason, we would have to individually update every single one of these ports that are being managed this way. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to switch it over to manual, and then we're going to go to Ethernet port profile, and we're going to select our management port profile. And we're going to do that for every single one of the ports that is either pointing to a switch or an access point or any physical hardware that you have. And then at that point, if we ever had to change it in the future, we can manage it through the port profile. Now, this is also the time where you're going to go in, and you're probably going to have more devices plugged in than I will, but you're going to go into all of your ports, and you are going to manually configure port profiles for them. So for port 1, I'm going to plug in a trusted device. It's going to be my computer. I'm going to select trusted, apply the changes, and then at that point, what you'll see is that the profile is set as trusted, and anything that gets plugged into port 1 will be on that trusted VLAN. This is a good visual of why people do not like to use VLAN ID 1 for their management network. It's because by default, everything will be for the management network. So you have to change it to get off of the management network. Again, in home environments, personally, I don't think it's that big of a risk, but if you wanted to, you could use something other than the default VLAN for your management network. So to show you one final time, port 2 will be for my IoT network. We're going to apply those changes. And then at that point, you'll see I have used all 3 port profiles. I am managing them centrally. If the IoT VLAN ever had to change, we could update them once, and then everything will be updated at the same time across all switches. So that's how we can configure ports on our switches. But what about our access points? Because our access points are what are going to be broadcasting our Wi-Fi SSIDs. So inside of the settings here, you will see Wi-Fi, and then you'll see that we don't currently have anything configured. So we're going to create a new one. I'm going to call it Trusted, and then I'm going to change the network to Trusted. This is important. This ensures that this SSID that we just configured with this password is going to point to the trusted VLAN. So any devices connected to this will be on the trusted network. Now, inside of here, you're going to see a lot of different settings. We're going to talk about Wi-Fi settings later, but inside of manual here, you'll have a bunch of options. The only things I really want to talk through is that for your trusted network, you don't really have to customize anything yet. You're probably going to want to use the default settings. Fast roaming you can turn on, but it's very dependent on your physical hardware. I have a Wi-Fi optimization video, and depending on how many access points you have, you're probably going to want to follow that because you really can fine tune in your access points. It's from an older version, but all of the same principles apply. So for now, I would recommend leaving everything at auto. But if you have a lot of access points, I'd recommend watching that video so that you can fine tune your setup. So we're going to create this, and now we have our first Wi-Fi SSID. So we're going to create a second Wi-Fi SSID, and we're going to call it IoT. Now this is where things change a little. So for the IoT network, you're generally dealing with older devices, and some of those older devices can run into connectivity issues. So this is where we are going to want to modify some of these settings. So in the manual section here, you'll see that we have a lot of options here. We have IoT, we have standard. You'll see that when we click IoT, it changes some of this. Now, IoT is basically, this used to be called IoT Enhanced in an older version of UniFi Network. But basically what it does is you'll see that it turns everything off except for 2.4 gigahertz. Now it does this because it's applying a lot of IoT policies for increased connectivity. For me, I leave this as standard and I keep 5 gigahertz on. And the reason for that is because newer IoT devices, I'll use an Amazon Fire TV as an example. It comes with 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi chip. If you keep 5 gigahertz disabled, it will only be able to use 2.4, and you can run into things like buffering issues, etc. So the way I like to do this is I like to start out leaving it like this, 5 gigahertz, basically default settings, except for turning 6 off. 6 is for Wi-Fi 7. There aren't going to be any Wi-Fi 7 IoT devices right now, so you don't need to leave that enabled. Generally, everything else can stay as default. The reason why I like to do it this way is because I like to do it, see if anything has any connectivity issues, and then modify this if I ever have to. If you do not want 2.4 gigahertz on, meaning you are going to disable it, use IoT here. It is configured properly. Use it, configure it this way, and you're going to have good IoT connectivity. If you leave it at standard and notice that you have connectivity issues with some of your IoT devices, generally, they'll be coming online and going offline fairly regularly. If you have any of those problems, you have two options. You can either turn IoT on over here, or you can create a second IoT SSID and then set that to have the IoT optimization. You have both options, but generally I like to leave it as standard with 5 on to then see how everything runs, and then you can customize it moving forward. Now, the last network that we are going to create is our guest Wi-Fi network. Now, this is going to be for our guests, anyone that is on our local network that is not us. Now, if you set hotspot optimization, you can use the captive portal, and what this will allow you to do is basically just have a captive portal that guests can connect to and then accept terms or whatever. This is going to be helpful for small businesses. For home environments, not really necessary. So I leave this as standard. And what you'll see is that when hotspot is on, there's no password because the password is managed through the portal that you can customize here. We're not doing anything like that. The only thing you might want to turn on is you might want to turn on client device isolation. This could be helpful in IoT as well, but not always. Client device isolation just ensures that devices that are connecting to the same access point cannot connect to one another. That's really all it does. So we're going to create that, and then what you will see is we now have our 3 SSIDs, and depending on what they connect to, that is the specific VLAN that they will be a part of. So if you have more VLANs or you want more SSIDs, you can create them here. Just be aware that there are caps, and for the most part, for most people, you're going to have 3, maybe 4 Wi-Fi SSIDs. The 4th would be for your surveillance network if you had a surveillance network. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk through is some of these Wi-Fi settings here. Now, Ubiquiti over the course of the past few months has really changed the Wi-Fi settings, and they've made it a lot easier than it used to be. But what you'll see is you have a few different options here, and conservative, if you see, switched all of these channel widths. So the important thing to understand for channel widths is that 2.4 should always be 20, and then 5 is either going to be 40 or 80, and 6 is either going to be 160 or 320. This is the width of the channel. The wider the width, meaning 80 is wider than 40, the faster the connection will be. A lower channel width will have less performance, but less interference as well. So the higher the width, The more interference you will potentially add into your network, the lower the width, the less interference you will have. Again, if you want to customize this, I would recommend you watch that video because multiple access points can be configured and fine-tuned for better overall performance. For me, for right now, because this is one access point, I'm just going to set this to be maximum speed, and then I'm going to apply that to all the access points, and then all the access points that you have will have these settings. Now, the last thing we'll take a look at is Channel AI. This is a new setting, but if you have multiple access points, I would recommend that you optimize it for each of them. But again, you need to have multiple. If you don't have multiple, you cannot use this feature. So now with that done, we are going to switch over to some security settings, and everything for the most part is going to be in this cyber secure section that you can enable or disable. And the first thing that we're going to enable is intrusion detection and prevention. So we're going to turn this intrusion prevention on, and then what you'll see is we have two options here: notify and block. The selected networks. These are the networks that intrusion prevention and detection will be applied to. So notify is intrusion detection. That means that it will notify you of potential issues, but it will not block anything. Notify and block will block things. So what you could do is you could start off with notify and then just monitor. You can monitor inside of the insights section here. And then if nothing appears, you can come in at a later time and turn on notify and block. Or if something appears and you wanted it to be blocked, you can. But this is a setting that if you just set it up as notify and block, you're probably going to be okay. But if things stop working, like an example would be SSH. If SSH stops working, it could be blocked by intrusion prevention. So you kind of have to know exactly what you're doing. At a minimum, you want this to be notify. However, if you want the best for right now, just turn on notify and block. Just be aware that if anything is blocked, if something isn't working, it could be this. So I'm going to apply these settings here. And now IDS and IPS is on and functional. Now, the next thing you can turn on, which a lot of people like to turn on, is region blocking. And what this allows you to do is select specific countries, and then you can go in after you select a country and determine if you want it to be blocked. So what you could do is if you wanted all traffic between your country and North Korea to be blocked, you would block it in both directions, and then incoming and outgoing traffic to that country will be blocked. You can go in and select as many countries as you want. Just be aware if you do both directions, if there's, let's say, a web server in one of those countries hosted there, you're not going to be able to access it. So if it doesn't work, this could be the reason why. You generally want this stuff on, but you have to be aware if something is not working, there's probably a reason why it's not working, and it's most likely going to be inside of here. Now, the only other setting I would recommend you turn on is content filtering, and you don't necessarily have to turn it on, but it could be helpful if you have kids or if you just want certain networks to not be able to do certain things. So let's say we wanted our guest VLAN to basically have basic filtering turned on. You can come in here, select your guest VLAN, turn it on. You could even turn on safe search if you wanted to, and then you could add that. And then at this point, the guest network would have basic filtering turned on. You can customize these a lot. You can even use UniFi ad blocking, which will basically block out ads. If you wanted to for your trusted VLAN, you can. But again, if something stops working, you have to come back here and see exactly what isn't working and try and figure out why. You could set this to be on a schedule, and overall, it is a very helpful thing. It's just that you want to fine tune this based on your individual settings, and I probably wouldn't start here with your trusted VLAN, but you can turn it on for your guest VLAN. So the last thing we're going to do from a security perspective is set up our firewall. And our firewall is going to be very important because this is what's going to determine exactly what VLANs can access one another. Now, right off the bat, I would recommend upgrading to the zone-based firewall. It is so much easier to manage, in my opinion, and it's just going to make the process a lot easier. So as soon as you upgrade to it, what you're going to see is this is the zone-based firewall. Now, I have a full video on the zone-based firewall. I can't go over everything in this video. We're going to have a basic setup here. But the zone-based firewall is really designed for you to create zones and then add VLANs to those zones. And then the zone that the VLAN is a part of, that is the access that that VLAN will have. So right off the bat, what we're going to do is we're going to create an untrusted zone, and this will help us explain how this works. So what you'll see is when we add an untrusted zone, by default, that untrusted zone cannot access our internal zone, can't access the VPN, hotspot, DMZ, or even itself. So this right here, any VLANs that you add to this will be completely isolated from accessing anything. So what's that a good candidate for? Well, it's a good candidate for our IoT network. So we're going to add it here. Now, the IoT network was a little different because if you remember earlier, what we did is we checked off the isolated option for this specific VLAN, and that's why this rule exists here. Now, if you didn't check off that checkbox, this rule would not exist. But again, it wouldn't be able to access anything because by default, the firewall rules block all traffic. With that said, I still think it's a best practice to add VLANs to specific zones, even if you isolated them. So if this VLAN was part of the internal zone like it was initially, it still would not be able to access anything because there is a default firewall rule that blocks that specific subnet from accessing anything else in the internal zone. So that checkbox is like an easy way to isolate networks. This is, we'll say, the more complex way, but it's the better way if you understand how the firewall works. It's the better way of managing things. So the next change that we're going to make is for our guest network. Now the hotspot zone here, this hotspot zone has rules that are really built for guest networks. So it's an easy one to just add your guest network to. And then when you apply those settings, what you'll see is if you click the hotspot zone, it's blocking access to the internal zone. It allows return traffic, but it cannot access the internal zone. There are specific policies that determine exactly what it can access for the gateway, for external. So external is the internet. The gateway is your UniFi cloud gateway itself, and then everything else is just default. So right now what we did, adding the guest network to the hotspot zone has isolated that network. It has specific policies for guest networks, and that is where it belongs. So now we're left with two VLANs, our trusted and our management VLAN. Now I like to leave both of those in the internal zone. The only thing you might want to do is you might want to say, well, trusted devices should not be able to access the management VLAN. And if you wanted to do that, you can create a policy that basically says block to management. And in the source zone, you would come in and you would select your trusted network. You would block that traffic, and then you would stop it from accessing the management network. And then by doing this, what you're in essence saying is that the trusted network cannot access the management network. That will in essence block any of that traffic. Now, in terms of if you want or do not want to do that, it's kind of up to you. It depends on what devices will be in that trusted network. But by default at this point, we have a completely segregated network where our management network, trusted network, guest network, and IoT network cannot access one another. But what I just said could be a problem because there are going to be times where you want your trusted network to be able to access your IoT network. So we're going to create one more rule. And that one rule is basically going to say our internal zone should be allowed to access our untrusted zone. So I'm going to create it. I'm going to say allow internal to untrusted. We are going to set the source as internal. We are going to allow traffic and auto allow return traffic. Now, auto allow return traffic basically means that if the internal zone connects to an untrusted device, that untrusted device can reply to that traffic, but the untrusted device cannot initiate a connection to the internal zone. So it's basically allowing access one way. If you do not check this off, the internal zone can connect to the untrusted zone, but the untrusted zone cannot reply to that traffic. So that's why you want to keep that on. So what you'll see is that that was set as block all earlier. And if we add that, you'll see it is now changed to allow all, and the untrusted is changed to allow return because now it can allow return traffic to the internal zone. Now, there's a lot more you can do with the firewall. And again, I would recommend that you watch that firewall video because it is going to be a much deeper dive into the firewall with much more granular controls, blocking access to the gateway itself so that like the untrusted IoT devices can't access the UniFi Cloud Gateway. But I can't really get into all of that right now in this video. So watch that video if you want to fine tune this because this firewall, if you understand how it works, it is extremely, extremely powerful. Now, the final thing that we're going to do is inside of our settings here, we are going to go to our control plane. Then we are going to go to backups, and we are going to ensure that system backups are turned on weekly. After you make all your changes, I would recommend that you back up now and then download that. That will ensure you have a backup of your entire configuration that you could restore from if you ever had to. But ensuring that this is turned on weekly is important. And the final thing I would do is in the updates section here, what you'll see is that automatic updates are turned on. This is highly dependent on you. If you are someone that is never going to come into here, you should leave automatic updates on because there are times when they include security updates. If you are somebody that wants to manage this and wants to ensure that updates don't break anything, I would recommend turning this off. You'll want to turn it off for the UniFi OS and UniFi Network as well, because they have individual settings, so you can turn it off for both of them. Just keep in mind that you would have to come in and periodically update the devices, but this ensures that you're not going to automatically be updated and kind of protects against potential issues. While infrequent, they do happen at times. Now, there is a lot more that you can do with your UniFi Cloud Gateway. There's object-oriented networking. There's granular firewall rules. There are policies, DNS records that you can implement, and that can and should be done in time. But for most people, this is going to get you to where you need to be with a basic setup. I'm hoping that you understood everything that we went through because, again, you're going to want to build on top of everything that we just went over, but at the same time, this is going to hopefully give you that building block that you can use to get to that point eventually. So I know this was a lot. I'm sure you have questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments. But other than that, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys next time.